So for our podcast today, we are joined by one of our professors of the faculty. Could you please shortly introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm Dr. Julia Martínez-Ariño, and I am a sociologist specialized in religion, so a sociologist of religion.
Okay.
And at the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies, I teach sociology of religion, but I also teach methods. I also teach classes on the Master on Religion, Conflict and Globalization.
Okay. So today I would like to talk about it's a bit about your book, Religion and Prison: An Overview of Contemporary Europe. Exactly. Thank you. Yes. But since that is quite specific, I would just like to start about talking a bit about the sociology or the fieldwork you actually conduct while being a sociologist. So could you maybe tell us something about what it is like to actually do some sociology fieldwork in a public institution?
Yeah. So this book comes out of research that we did in prisons, but also in hospitals, and I have also done research in schools. And so the idea was researching how religion is present in public, secular, in principle, organizations, and then try to find out how it is present and how it is dealt with. So basically, doing fieldwork in these institutions means that one has to go and be there. So go into the prison, going into hospital, walk around, sit in a classroom in a school, and try to not only look at religion, so the physical, material aspects of religion, but also how people talk about it, how people express it or not in these environments. So basically, for me, it meant visiting several prisons with all the, of course, official permits to get in, visit several hospitals, try to find if there were spaces where religion is practiced, if there are symbols, if people talk about it in these spaces or not. So one has to go with a different kind of glasses to these institutions, because all of us visit, especially hospitals, prisons, not so often. And if you would ask around, have you seen any religious element in the hospital? Most of the people probably haven't seen anything. But when you go with these lenses, then you realize that it is much more present than we initially think.
Why these institutions? Because it seems a pretty specific topic, especially the prison part. For me, like you just said, for me, hospitals are, well, I don't visit them often, but I have visited them a couple of times in my life, and I don't think I've ever visited a prison. I hope not to. Why these institutions?
Yeah, so these institutions are particularly important and interesting to look at because they are state institutions. So as such, in contemporary Western Europe, they are supposed to be secular institutions that kind of have no direct link with the state, with the church or with any organized religion in principle. So they have to follow the rules of the state, the principles of religious freedom, principles of state-church separation, but also, and specifically, this applies to the prison and partly also to hospitals, to the army, to the police. They are closed institutions, and the prison is the closest of all of them. Is the one that is a closed environment, and so the life of people happens there. And because they are run by states, the state is the one responsible for ensuring that the rights of individuals are granted and are protected, among which the right to practice their own religion. And so when one looks at these closed environments, one can see how, more generally, the rules around religious freedom, around accommodation of religious diversity are seen very specifically. So it's a way of, there is an author that says that prisons are society in miniature. So it's like a small representation of society in a closed space. And by looking at these well delimited spaces, we can learn more about how societies relate to religion and to religious diversity more broadly.
You just touched upon the separation of state and church, but especially prisons. I'm pretty sure they are completely government owned. But then again, there is a religious influence because that's what you're actually studying with this, looking at with this book. Isn't there like a slight clash of I would say laws, because it's quite clear in our law system that the church and state is separated, but then again I'm not sure what we find in prisons. I actually read a bit from your book and I saw some things that we could find. But isn't it kind of weird that that is actually there? Because I get that practically, yes, it's a reflection of society, but should that be allowed according to our laws?
Well, actually, in most European countries, there is some kind of clause or specific article that makes the state responsible for the practice of religion in prisons. In other institutions, it's a bit less clear because they are more open. But if in the case of prisons, also the army, if the state does not take responsibility of providing this service in one way or another, then the right to religious freedom is violated by the state itself. So once this is taken into account, the ways in which the state then provides for that right are very different, and it could also lead to situations where there is too much presence of religion or one particular religion that has been the majority religion and that is already part of the institution almost. This is something that can be observed in many countries in Europe, that Christianity, the different types of Christianity, Catholicism, Protestantism, Orthodox Christianity, because it has been a historical church very often linked to the state, this is also very easy to find in these institutions, that certain patterns of relationship between church and state are still visible in these institutions. So there is the risk that the separation is sometimes crossed, in these institutions.
But so in most cases, the value of religious freedom is actually the most important one, and sometimes it crosses a boundary. Well, it crosses the law basically, but in most cases the religious freedom is important. Or would you say in all cases you've seen?
Well, the fact that the right to religious freedom is legally recognized and officially recognized, not only in constitutions or specific laws, but also at the European level, doesn't mean that there are no situations in which the rights of individuals, of inmates, for example, are violated. So are not violated. Sometimes it happens that the conditions for the practice of religion are not always ideal or provided for. One also has to think how specific the situation is in prisons, how specific it is in the army. So the ways in which the institution arranges religion vary a lot. And it also depends on the religious history of the country, the type of religious groups that come to prison or to other institutions. One has to think the state is responsible for ensuring that the right of religious freedom is respected, but the state does not provide religion. The state allows certain religious people to come in to provide this service. Sometimes it's paid by the state, often it's paid by the state, but in very few cases nowadays, the people who provide religious services are members of the state administration. In some countries, they are still civil servants, but in most of them they are not.
Okay. A bit more practical. Can you name some forms of religion we can see present in prisons? Because I can think of, at least in a hospital, most of the times there's a silence room, I would call it, where people can grieve or go to think in difficult times. But prisons, what can we see there?
Yeah, well, we can see many things, as I said before, if we keep our eyes wide open.
Yeah.
So in many prisons, especially in older ones, there is a space. Usually there was a chapel. Now it can be a multi-purpose space that is used for theater representation, religious services, psychotherapy groups, whatever. So that varies a lot, but that's one thing. So the spatial element. Another aspect is the material presence of religion. So religious symbols that usually are remnants from the past that are not seen anymore. So sometimes you see crosses or a Madonna that people don't often see because they have been there always. But also in a more festive way, religion is present in Christmas celebration, Easter celebration, the celebration of Ramadan. When someone wants to convert and get baptized, for example, or when someone dies and there is some sort of celebration. Prisons have the same religious life as one would find outside, but all of it concentrated in a quite close space. So in food, for example, the provision of menus, different kinds of menus, either vegetarian for religious purposes or kosher or halal. Or when someone wants to fast for Easter. So all these elements become visible symbols that people can or cannot wear in prison. All this, the presence of Bibles in people's rooms. One could think of so many examples. Yeah.
Now, are there major differences between countries, and especially between countries that have different religions? So maybe Spain and the Netherlands. I mean, it's both Christianity, but it's a clear distinction between Protestantism and Catholicism. And at least in the Netherlands, Islam is quite present as well. I'm not sure about Spain, but are there differences in things you encounter and in policies that the countries enact or the prisons enact?
Yeah, so the book actually is an edited volume, so it contains chapters for 23 countries in Europe. And so here we can see the differences, and they are present in many ways. So on the one hand, the religious configuration of the population who lives in these places. So of course, in the Netherlands or in Bulgaria, the religious composition is different than in Italy or Spain. So the majorities that are present in the broader society are also reflected in prisons, for example, or in hospitals, the army. However, it's true that there is also an overrepresentation in many countries of immigrant, ethnic minority groups in prisons because of how the legal system is enforced, because of police practices, etc. So we also find the presence of minority religions. And indeed, Islam is one of the biggest of the minority groups, but also evangelical groups, some Buddhists, not many, Jehovah's Witnesses, Jewish people. So we do find that. Another difference that we find in how prisons and other institutions deal with religion is the history of countries matter. So we see that former communist countries have certain patterns and certain ways of dealing with religion, which differ from countries like the Netherlands or Germany that have always had more than one religious group, that also differ from countries like Italy or Spain that have had a monopoly, a Catholic monopoly for many years. So one has to look at how the religious and political history of each country has shaped the way in which different institutions deal with religion. And so, for example, in the Netherlands, we find that there are, and this is changing in many societies. In many countries, we see that there are representatives of many different religious groups because European societies are becoming more diverse.
Why so many countries? I mean, it's always good to compare. I understand, but I looked at the, like I said, I looked at the excerpt of the book with all the titles, and there are a lot. And I understand. Well, I understand the comparison, but could you maybe go a bit more into that? Why these countries?
Yeah. So we actually have 26 countries, including Russia and Turkey, among others. And then we have Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, Czech Republic, the Netherlands, Montenegro, Romania, Sweden, so many of them. So this is a book that comes out of a research network that is called UREL. And we have representatives from different countries. And the reason that we wanted to incorporate so many countries is that we have a lot of research on, quite some research on prisons and religion in France, the Netherlands, Germany, England, Spain, Italy, and Switzerland. These are, and the Scandinavian countries. But apart from that, we know very little. So we really wanted to have a broader perspective and see, okay, what is happening in other contexts? And for some countries, we had very little empirical research incorporated in the book because there haven't been any research projects on that, or it's difficult to access prisons. Not every country allows researchers to do research in these public institutions easily. But still, we thought it would be good to have a broader perspective on Europe to move beyond the classical cases that we always study. And it was actually very productive because studying, for example, all the Eastern European countries is just so interesting. It provides quite a different perspective from Western, Central European countries. Yeah.
Could you name a small difference between the Eastern European countries studied and, for example, France?
Yeah. So one interesting thing with some of the post-communist countries or former communist countries is that they used to have certain religious histories. Then with communism, religion was banned or was privatized. And this is also reflected in prisons, right? And then when the Soviet Union fell and the political regime changed again, there was a reincorporation of religion in prison in a way that recuperated some elements from before communism, but there were new elements incorporated. This is something that we don't observe, this change of political regime. We don't observe that in France, Germany, Italy over the last decades. This has happened in Eastern Europe. And this element we would have missed were we not studying these countries, for example. Just one example.
Okay, so instead of a stable progression, really fluctuating progression in the Eastern European countries.
Yeah, one can see that we in general tend to understand history as a linear process, but then events happen that may transform or may change the course of events, the way in which events develop. And so this can also affect the ways in which states relate to religion. Yeah.
A small, maybe a more personal question to wrap this podcast up, because we've already been talking for 20 minutes. Did you do empirical research in Spain, the chapter you wrote on?
Yeah.
Could you maybe share something that a moment or an experience you really cherish is the wrong word, but really something that stuck with you?
Yeah.
Just a moment in a prison and you think, whoa, I've never thought about this, I've never seen this, wow.
Yeah, I had many of those actually.
Okay.
Prisons are very special context and very hard and context. But I remember participating in an evangelical service. So this was a small group of maybe 7 men and the pastor who. And so I came in with the pastor into the prison, and we were in this room. I don't remember if it was the small library of the prison or what it was exactly. And so they were praying, and you could see some of them crying because, of course, they are facing very difficult circumstances. And it was very hard to be there and knowing that I was going to leave the prison in a few hours, but they would stay there and they would speak, and you could see how much they were suffering. But at the same time, how being in that group in that moment was a kind of relief for them, at least in that time that we were there together.
Did you know why they were incarcerated, or was that out of the scope you were studying?
Yeah, we never asked that question. Actually, I mostly talked to prison staff, prison managers, and of course with inmates when I was participating in the services, and they were very curious, like, what is this young woman doing in this man's prison? What are you doing here? And I would always explain I'm doing research, but of course, like, what are you doing research on here in this prison? Yeah.
Yeah, understandable.
Yeah. Mm.
Okay. Thank you so much. I would have liked to talk a little bit longer, but then again, we need to keep it short.
Thank you.
Thank you.